Hello everyone, I'm Simon Allford. Welcome to 66 Portland Place. Great to see it buzzing, a different kind of atmosphere. This room can suck the life out of you, but tonight it will probably inject us all with life, which is great. So I'm delighted to welcome you here. You know what this is about because you've bought tickets. This is another in-person Building Stories talk. This is a series where we celebrate RIBA awards and we invite the team, however they see their team, to talk about it. I think it's really kind of important idea that awards aren't just celebrating an idea of what good practice might look like around the country, but also different scales, but also how different people make architecture and their relationship with client and consultants, and obviously history, building on the shoulders of the history of the place that they're in. So, as you know, on the 13th of October, we held a party at Portland Place to celebrate the announcement of this year's Stirling Prize winner. And this evening, of course, it's my pleasure to introduce Níall McLaughlin Architects, the team behind the new library at Magdalene College, Cambridge. They're all here, and they'll be coming on stage in a moment. But first, I want to thank our sponsors who help us make these events and the whole awards programme run. And they are Taylor Maxwell, Michelmersh and Gaggenau. So a big thanks to them for supporting all that we are trying to do to project architecture back to our members, but also back to the wider public. And the Stirling, of course, is the biggest celebration of that because it becomes a kind of almost a global news event, and it's accessed by a much, much bigger audience. So I think that is part of what the RIBA, long-term needs to be, a connector and collector of ideas, of memberships, harnessing talent, projecting that out, engaging with the public, engaging with government, and opening up the discourse on architecture, allowing different voices to be heard, people working at different scales, and also people challenging us with different ideas. But this particular project looks back 700 years and also forward 400 years. It's a new library, an incredibly challenging project. It's open 24 hours a day. It's a kind of, when you go there, it's a library, it's a place of work, it's a place of gathering, it's a place where people can work on their own, but in a collegiate atmosphere, or come together. There's kind of a very clever acoustic that allows people to sort of do what they want to do, but also engage with others. It isn't a silent place. It's a place full of life. It's set within the college grounds, very challenging. I no doubt we'll hear about that. A challenging site. It replaces cramped study spaces, and the brief was to move them from an adjacent 17th century Grade 1 listed Pepys library, which we broke into when we were visitors, because we thought that the time that allowed us to get into the library was when we were judging their building. It extends the quadrangular arrangement in a different kind of way. It talks across time with that building, with its site, with the amazing context in which it sits. It's a unique setting with a clear purpose. So I talked about 700 years back, but also it's a brief for a 400-year building. So it's a building that's robust, that's timeless, that's intelligent, that almost, I would say, is almost free of finishes. It's a building which is made of what you see. And that challenge is what we're going to hear about tonight. There's no lectern, by the way, in this new informal version, so I can't look down at my notes. But it's one that the practice, Níall McLaughlin Architects, has risen to with extraordinary skill, which is, of course, why you're here. So first, I'd like to hand over to the team who will introduce themselves, and there will be a series of talks through it. But the first people I'd like to hand over to Claire McMenamin, Project Architect, and Tim Allen Booth Associates, so they can tell us the story behind the 2022 Stirling Prize-winning building.
Good evening. Thank you, Simon. Thanks for coming. This evening we wanted to give you a sense of this as a team project, as Simon was talking about. It was a huge collaborative effort. And so I'm really delighted that we have with us this evening Ben Sellers from Max Fordham, who's going to talk about the building services design. And there was a really important collaboration between building services, structural design, and architecture in this project. And so we want to try and bring all three of those aspects together this evening. And so we'll also have a video from Simon Smith, from Smith & Woolwork, who's the structural engineer for the project. Unfortunately, couldn't be with us this evening. But now I'd like to hand over to the project architect, Claire McMenamin.
Okay. So in 2014, we were appointed by Magdalene College to design a new library, gallery and archive. And this in turn would allow for the refurbishment of the Grade 1 listed Pepys building, which had housed the library. And it would also allow for expansion of the book collection, and crucially it would allow the opportunity to create more and better spaces for the students and staff to study. So this map from the 1500s shows that while most of the colleges in Cambridge were located in the centre of Cambridge, Magdalene College was located on the periphery to the north of the river. The River Cam here, and this is Magdalene just to the north of it. It was initially established as a monastery for Benedictine monks, and it was said that it was located there to keep the monks away from the temptations of the town. And since then, there's been a sort of continuous tradition of academic study on the site for about 500 years. And this drawing by Logan of the 1500s shows buildings which are still in use by the college today. So we can follow the route to our site. From Magdalene Street, we enter through an archway and we arrive in First Court, which is formed of brick buildings. We then pass through another archway and we arrive in the more open Second Court. Here we're met by the neoclassical stone facade of the Pepys building. Beside the Pepys building, there's a little gateway through which we arrive on our site, which is located in the Fellows Garden. And at this time, it was quite a formal garden on the edge of the River Cam. And building to last in the way that the existing college buildings were built was an important precedent for a building. They were built with durable materials and they were repaired many times. And the Fellows Garden today is a more informal garden. It's got a lot of mature trees, and the elevations of the Pepys building, which face the Fellows Garden and or site, is quite different to the elevations that face Second Court. Here it's a brick building with simple window openings. And although the site, I guess, appears quite open, there was a lot of constraints which led to the position and massing of the building. The floodplain of the River Cam extends over a lot of the Fellows Garden. There's a lot of mature trees. There's a pet cemetery to the north, and there's a listed garden wall to the west. And in the early stages of the project, there was a lot of debate about whether it was appropriate to put a new building here at all. And Historic England were very good with, they sort of gave the planners confidence that a good building could be positioned here in this context successfully. And it was through those conversations that the exact position of the library was determined. So it's in line with the existing garden wall, and the entrance faces the side of the Pepys building, which extends the quadrangular arrangement of the college. And I'll hand over to Tim now.
Thanks, Thanks, Claire. So this idea of the monks being secluded across the river and chimed with the brief we had from the college, which said that the real purpose of the new library was to create a study space in which students could put aside the kind of worldly distractions and focus on their studies. And that made us think of this painting by the Renaissance artist Antonello de Messina, which is painted about 50 years after Magdalene College was founded in 1476. It's an amazing painting. And what we liked about this as a reference for this project was the scholar sits at the center of the image very deliberately, the perspective of the painting falling into the middle of the page and the light falling onto the book that the scholar is holding. And the scholar sits on this quite strange piece of furniture, timber construction, which is a desk, a dais, a bookshelf, and somewhere a piece of architecture in its own right. And that timber architecture sits in a bigger masonry frame, which is the sort of spacious hall which has both large openings which let light into the hall and gives this views out of the opposite side of the space towards this kind of parkland landscape. And so this image became a kind of touchstone for the project. So kind of what is a college library? These three images show a kind of key period in the development of college libraries. The colleges in Cambridge and Oxford, there are kind of three main spaces where the community comes together. One is the hall where they eat, one is the chapel, and one is the library. And so the sort of spiritual, intellectual, and nourishment are provided in these three different spaces. And so these three images of libraries in Cambridge show how basically the impact of the printing press on the college library. On the left-hand side is Trinity Hall, one of the oldest libraries in Cambridge, and this is a lectern type of library. And we're interested in this relationship of the desk space to the reader and the illumination of the space and where you place windows in it and where the books are held. And so you begin in the beginnings of the college library. Books are an incredibly rare and precious resource, and so they're all chained to the desk and they're held in these kind of lectern arrangements where you have the books beneath and you lift them up onto the lectern and you read them standing up. And the room is a long room with a central aisle down the middle, and the reading space is off to either side, and it's illuminated from the sides by quite low-level windows. And then as the kind of quantity of books available increases, in the middle this is Queen's College Library, and here they've adapted a lectern library. You can see the sort of curving bases of the lecterns have been chopped off at the top, and an extended bit of bookshelf's been stuck on the top. And this room is still illuminated from the sides, and that produced a problem because the room starts to become quite dark on one side because the bookshelves are cutting off the light that's spilling in from the windows along the sides. And then in the final image, you see Wren's library for Trinity College. And here he kind of resolves this problem by making it a two-story space and having light flooding in from above. And you can see the two plans at the bottom here, Trinity Hall and Trinity College, they're the same scale, so you can see the enormous expansion of the library as a repository for books. I do think the main problem of the Trinity College Library is, if I can dare to criticize Christopher Wren, is that there's no way to gaze out of the window when you're bored of your book. So for Magdalene College's library, we wanted to kind of produce something which had a bit of a mixture of all these types of space. The college had done a survey of all their students early on in the design process, and they wanted different things from a college library. And so we thought a kind of inclusive type of modern library will be one in which people can situate themselves in different spaces around the library, and rather than having a consistent type of relationship between reading spaces and bookshelves. And so on the left, you can sit yourself in a larger grand hall. If you like that kind of vista, you can find a small enclosed room with a shared table with other readers, or you can sort of perch yourself into a corner in a little nook. And that's so the design of the library, we tried to find a way in which we could generate a plan form for the library which produced that sort of variation. So we began by testing the actual size of a desk. The college stipulated in their brief it had to be a certain dimension, but we tested that to see whether we could squeeze it a bit or enlarge it in places to work out what the limits of our maneuverability were on the plan. So here is our testing different desk sizes. And the college said they wanted a mixture of reading spaces, 50-50 more or less between individual desks and shared reading tables. And so we began by kind of setting out a room which contained one of these shared reading tables with room for 6 readers around a central table and with bookshelves around the edges and a room lit from the side. So it's a relatively small, compact space, and we tested lots of different dimensions of that space to get the right sense of enclosure and intimacy, but have enough room to move around the table. And we came to this plan form, which is square, and it's a dimension of 4.7 meters in each direction. And this became the kind of basic building block of our plan. And around the edges of that space, then we have a kind of zone, which is, you can see at the top left big enough for a double-sided book to accommodate a double-sided bookshelf. Below that, it can accommodate a desk, and it can also accommodate services and an external wall plus a bookshelf. So it was calibrated to be big enough to accommodate all these things just about. And that became a kind of essential dimension within our building, which is actually 3 bricks long. And then we looked at how we would aggregate those rooms into a larger plan. And we wanted the form of the room to remain legible within the plan. And so we thought about this building on the left here, the Central Bahia office building by Hermann Hertzberger. And it's an amazing plan form. And there was a sort of resonance for the project for us because he was trying to humanize, in a way, the open plan office. And we're trying to find a way to make people feel situated in an essentially open plan library space. And then the 2 plans on the right, both by Lou Kahn, the Trenton Bath House and the Richards Medical Research Laboratory. And in a similar way, we enjoy the way the different parts of the plan are legible. And they use this, what we call a tartan grid, which has a major and a minor interval within it to space the elements apart and give the building a kind of rhythm. And we thought that sort of plan form might allow us to produce the variation in seating types and position within the library that we were looking for. So here are a couple of sketches, and you can sort of see, we started off with a kind of linear bar, 3 linear bars connected by passageways running in the opposite direction, and then the sketch below that, the plan, is starting to show passageways running in 2 directions. So this is the kind of the way the plan evolved to what you see today. And so this is a diagram of our building plan. The beige squares are the reading rooms. The grey zones are those zones around the reading rooms that accommodate all the bookshelves and other walls and everything else that needs to be there. At the corners of those reading rooms, you get an L-shaped column, which allows us to bring the load down through the building. And then spacing these square spaces apart, you get passageways, the white zones running in 2 directions. And where they cross, you get a kind of node. And that gives us a wider space as a passing place, which allowed those passageways to actually be quite tight. They're only 1.3 meters wide. And those nodes we use to develop the structural scheme and the building services scheme for the building. And so our plan form is 3 bays by 5 bays, and it has a bit missing on its corner. And you can see when we put the plan into the site, as Claire was explaining earlier, that the building is kind of nestled into this bank of trees on the edge of the site, and its 3-bayed facade faces into the master's garden here, while its longer facade faces into the bigger space of the fellows' garden. And then its short flank squares up to the end of the Pepys building, and part of that conversation Claire was talking about with Historic England, because our building is a bit wider, we sort of splay out this path rather than so it doesn't run quite perpendicular to the back of the Pepys building in order to give ourselves enough room to get our 3 bays in. And the building's actually quite deep plan. On its short dimension, it's 20 meters across, so it's quite hard to get good natural light in the middle of the plan. And we thought about ways of doing that, and this put us in mind of the amazing top-lit spaces of John Soane's buildings, the Bank of England project, and here at Lincoln's Inn Fields, the way he brings light down right into the depth of the section. And we loved the richness of this section and tried to kind of work some of that sense of layering, which you can see the sort of A-B rhythm again here into our scheme. And so what we did was we placed a roof lantern at the top of each of our squares of reading room, and that brings light all the way down into the plan, and they're separated by the width of the passageways running beneath them, around those spaces. And the lantern is just quite simply formed of 2 pitched roofs crossing at right angles, and the triangular gables are then glazed. And in the corners of this space, you can see that the load of the lantern drops down onto a point at this corner and then is brought down a column a brick column in the corner. And this is the structural diagram for how that works. You see the L-shaped brick column dropping down through the floor plates, timber floor plates, and then the main structural beams, which then pass through those columns, resting on precast concrete lintels that connect the columns together. And these brick constructions rise up through the building and become chimneys as they exit through the roof, which Ben will talk about later. And this gives you this landscape at roof level of folded roof lanterns and then pinned in place by this set of chimneys. And so having made this kind of spatial matrix, this mat-like building of squares set apart by passageways, we started to think about how you would navigate through the library. And we knew at this point that the library would need to be spread over 3 floors, and that at the ground level there wouldn't be very much library. And there was a long conversation, which is an interesting one, with the college about how we would connect the entrance to the library, probably where the librarian would be, with the upper floors where most of the library floor plate would be. And we had this idea of a journey through the library, which was a sort of a diagonal upward journey towards the light, towards the view of the river and the garden that the building looks into. And it produced this kind of diagonal movement in the section. And you can see it here in this sectional sketch from the ground floor up to the top of the building. And we thought this diagonal movement might also be matched as a movement in plan. And so this is the building section. You come in here at the base of the building at ground floor level into a 3-story space here, and you make your way up to the first floor. The first main level of library is via a stair, which delivers you into a 2-story space in the middle of the plan, and then you find another staircase, and you work your way up to a room sort of up in the roof with the view out towards the garden. And that movement, as I said, is matched in plan. So you see this is the 3-story space. It's 1 bay in plan. The 2-story space in the middle is 2 bays in plan, and the single-story long reading room at the top is 3 bays in plan. And they're connected by stairs at the ends. So you get this kind of diagonal movement through the building. This is the ground floor plan. You come in the middle into a lobby. Ahead of you is the archive facility and a room for scholars to research the archive. Off to your right, looking out towards the garden, is a long gallery space with French windows that open out into the garden. And so you can see most of the ground floor is taken up by things that are not really the library. And this is the first library space, a square reading room, our triple height space, and off that, the librarian's office. And so that's the entrance, the 3-story space, with reading desks lining that space on the upper floors on 3 sides, and a big window behind you, bay window looking out towards the master's garden. And off the back of that space, you take a stair and you pop out at one of these 2 bay windows at the back of the building, at its sort of stepped rear side of the building, out into the tree canopy before you head back in, and you arrive at the north end of the central reading room with a long reading table down the middle of that plan. That's our sort of grand space within the building. So this is the first floor plan, and you've arrived here on the stair at this little bay window, and you're standing here looking down that long space. And all the smaller rooms are kind of arranged along this side of that reading room, so they get the view out towards the garden. And then you take another stair, and we're popping out at the top there through another bay window. And arriving onto 2nd floor here, and then looking down this long reading room, and you see the voids of the other 2 void spaces within the building, here and here. So here we are, kind of up in the roof, and you see off to the right of that image the view out towards the garden. And so while we've been kind of enjoying the organization of the building as a problem to solve, the client for the project was very concerned about this object that they were going to put within the historic centre of the college. And they became particularly concerned when we started talking about putting chimneys on the outside of the building, and thought that we were going to make some sort of factory. So we had an interesting conversation with them about that, about the design of the outside of the building. And the way we tried to explain what we were going to do was we showed them these images of English country houses, particularly the top image of Moynes Hall in Essex, an Elizabethan prodigy house. And what we enjoyed about this was the way in which it uses a kind of a suite of elements which you can find around the college, pitched roofs with gables, chimneys, bay windows with that kind of stone tracery here. And we said to the college we would make the architecture of the exterior of the building out of this kind of suite of elements, so it would feel like it belonged to the college. And so this is the west facade looking into the master's garden. And you see we have a central bay flanked by the more solid bits of the plan which kind of gravitate towards the corners of the building, giving you these kind of three centered facades. This is looking at the south facade with the yew tree on the left there, and then the longer facade towards the Fellows Garden with the three bays on that side. And this idea of making a bay window and making a space of it that you can occupy is something that the practice has been sort of working at in a way for a long time. And this is a very early project of the practice, a window bay, timber window bay for a house in South London, a sort of meticulously detailed piece of timber construction. And I think in thinking about these kinds of details, we've looked a lot at this project, the Esherick House by Lucan, and the way in which he constructs this, particularly the upper window that you see there. It gets this fixed central bit and then opening shutters on either side, which is set back. And what it gives you is a way of projecting yourself into the garden, and then a way of ventilating the space that kind of protects the glazed space of the window. And that worked really well for a reading room. And it's a similar idea to one we explored with the same contractor, actually, at Jesus College in Cambridge. So our timber window bays, they're kind of made of three components. At ground floor, it's a French window illuminating our gallery space. At first floor level, it's a fixed window with shutters on either side illuminating a small reading room. And then at second floor level, it's a wide bay with a built-in desk illuminating our long reading room. And that's how it looks on the outside. So I'm now going to hand over to Ben Sellers, who's going to talk about building services.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, I'm Ben from Max Fordham. Thank you for Tim. Initially, we looked at lots of different options for the strategy for the building. We looked at fully air-conditioned, we looked at a mixed mode, we looked at natural ventilation. We also visited several different libraries with libraries around Cambridge with the college, and there was a clear preference following that for natural ventilation. So that's how we arrived at the strategy for this. We wanted to make use of manual windows in the facade so that people can just control their own environment. To help make that work, we made use of the chimneys on the roof of the building to allow the stack effect, so buoyant air leaves the top of the building, bringing fresh air from the outside through the facades. The brick construction actually boosts that effect, so the fact that they're being warmed in the sun adds to the buoyant effect of air being drawn up and out to the top of the building. So the chimneys are also key for winter ventilation. They're located in the center of the plan, and opening them a little bit will allow cool air to enter reasonably far away from where occupants are seated, so avoiding issues with drafts. Each of the chimneys is an actuator at the base, so that keeps the thermal line of the building reasonably straightforward. They're in the plane of the roof, so avoiding having to insulate the chimneys. They're controlled on temperature in the summer, so when the temperature gets above 25, they begin to open. And then in the wintertime, they're controlled on CO2 in the space, so when that gets above 1,000 parts per million, they will begin to open. We also have additional openings in the roof in the centre of the plan, which are primarily for smoke ventilation, and they also sort of boost the natural ventilation when everything's open in those hottest days. So how does it perform in the recent heat wave of July? So you can see there, 19th of July, we had 40 degrees in Cambridge, and I think quite successfully on the ground floor we had 25 inside and just over 30 on the top floor, which I think is quite successful for such an extreme test. Moving on to the archive, which we have in the centre of the plan. So at the ground floor, as Tim mentioned earlier, we have the storeroom, as you can see in the centre at the bottom, and in front of that, the reading room, where readers will have a look at material that has been brought out by an invigilator. So the brief for that was to sort of consolidate a lot of different archival stores that the college had that weren't particularly well controlled. So the brief for this space was for a mixed paper archive, and that requires stable temperature and quite low humidity. So the design we came up with was for a passive approach, which avoided complex and expensive systems, and instead relied on passive ways of keeping the conditions stable. So we use an uninsulated ground floor slab, which acts as a heat sink to make use of thermal mass below the ground. The space is incredibly airtight and very well insulated, and makes use of thermal mass on the inside so that the structure of the archive itself. It also has a small ventilation system which runs from time to time when the conditions outside are right, so that it gets some free cooling or some free dehumidification. And there's also a small dehumidifier, which again runs just to keep the humidity below an upper limit. And again, how did we perform? It's on that hottest day of 40 degrees, no air conditioning, and we have a stable 20 degrees. And the temperature in there just follows a gentle swing across the seasons, getting to about 16 in the winter and about 20 in the summertime. I'll talk briefly now about some of the other parts of our scope. So we were acoustic consultants on the project as well. And reverberation control was something that was quite key for the project, to make sure that the space worked well as a library, being completely open plan. So that's achieved a lot by the books that are in the space, but also we needed to think about reflections off the soffit. So there's absorption behind the slatted timber soffit that you can see up on there. Services distribution through the building was quite a challenge with all the exposed structure. So we came up with an approach which is to put all the services within a floor void instead of a ceiling void. So by separating layers that are already in the project, so the CLT structural slab and the timber floor, we can kind of get that void without having to add very much material to the building. From an acoustics perspective, we're also quite interested in controlling footfall noise. So people walking around the timber floor with structural timber can be a problem. So to mitigate that, we had this rubber layer, which you can see in this sort of here, which acts to dampen any impact noise on the floor. And that was carefully chosen to make sure that the floor still felt robust when people are walking past you if you're seated. And also the weight of the bookshelves weren't really capable of being sat on top of that, so they were built on the plinth, which you can see in that detail there. The underneath of that soffit, you can see where we had lighting, to cabling and other things would just pop straight through from that void, through the slab to connect where they needed to be. So the lighting design in the building made use of pendants and surface-mounted light fittings, which are set to just sort of a background lighting level. And then bookshelves, we have a light fitted to the top of each of those, which sort of helps illuminate the books so that people can identify what they're looking for, and also just define the edges of all the spaces and help people navigate around. And then task lights on the desk so that people can control their own environment and keep the sort of brighter bits just to where it's needed. Outside the building, we have this lovely image from the Fellows Garden at night. You can see the internal pitched roofs, so they're also visible. So having these lit from below, we had some uplighters giving those a nice wash of light, and I think that helped sort of give the space a sense of height and also gives a backdrop to the long views through the building. External lighting was really kept to a minimum. We wanted to keep it in keeping with the rest of the college, which is quite a dark space at night. So it's really just provided to the path at the front, the entrance, and then highlighting some of the key features on the facade facing the Fellows Garden. Thank you. I'll pass back to Claire.
Thank you, Ben. So the building is made primarily from two materials, brick and timber. Externally, the brick relates to the existing buildings of the college, and internally there's a warp and weft of timber materials that sit, or timber elements that sit between brick piers. And we wanted it to feel very kind of crafted and intuitive, so that pieces of structure that you can see are visibly sitting on the other piece that's holding it up. And the existing college buildings display rich tapestries of brickwork that have been repaired over centuries. And this repair work has kind of added to the pattern and the quality of the brickwork. And we wanted to try and get some of this character into our building. We had gone through a process of choosing a brick. We had it approved with the client and the planners. And we found out just before the building started on site that brick was not going to be made anymore. It was going out of production, which gave us quite a fright. But the site manager, Julian from Coxage, then introduced us to this brick, which was a brick from York Hand made. And it had a really nice textural quality and a nice mix of colours that sat really well beside the Pepys building. So we explored that further, and we went up to York Handmade with Coxage, and we worked very carefully with Coxage and with York Handmade to develop a kind of mix of colours and textures that would sit well beside the existing buildings. And we got to see how in the factory they throw the bricks by hand, and they sort them by hand, and they're made in these timber moulds, which gives the surface a really nice texture. And these were the four colours that we ended up using in the mix. And this was the first sample panel where we got the kind of ratios of the colours to the kind of correct mix that we wanted. The bricks are about 5 millimetres smaller in every direction than a standard modern brick, and the mortar joints are 5 mil larger, so they're 15 mil joints. The mortar is a mix of sand, cement and lime, and it's brushed to reveal some aggregate. And the vertical structure of the building is brick, so a key part of that is these L-shaped piers that rise up through the building. They're brick filled with mortar and some reinforcement. And then the external wall of the building is quite traditional. It's 2 leaves of brick with insulation and a cavity. And this point in the project was quite early on, but it was quite challenging, I think, for the team on site. And for us, there was lots of things happening because the building with its visual structure sort of changed the sequence of a typical building, I guess. And we were setting out kind of the pieces that would be the finished surface, and then we were also working with teams who were making items off-site as well. And yeah, a challenge for the site team to get the tolerances right, and then there was quite a complex mix of bricks, so we were keen to not have any cut bricks. So and the team at York Handmade were making these bricks, and we ended up having sort of 1 brick for every letter of the alphabet, and it was quite nice. They turned up on site with their names imprinted on the surface, so it was and in some ways, I guess the building is quite traditional. In other ways, it's highly engineered, and it took collaboration between people with a wide range of skills to be able to make it happen, and that collaboration was really key to its success. So when we reached this point at the top of the chimneys, it was a real moment of celebration, I think, for the whole team. The project was design and build, so we were innovated to the contractor, and I think while we were working for the client, and also when we were working on Coxage's team, there was a real sense of kind of dedication from the whole team, the client, the builders, the engineers, the consultants, to build a building of really high quality that would last for a long time. And then the horizontal structure then is timber, so it's CLT slabs and glulam beams. We worked quite closely with Smith and Wallwork, the structural engineers, and also Urban and now Hosper, who provided the CLT and the glulam. The glulam came from Switzerland, and I think they've estimated that it just under 8 minutes it would take to regrow the structural timber for the project relative to how much timber is grown in Switzerland. And so the plan of the building then, this shows these large glulam beams which run along the passageways. So it's in keeping with the grid plan which Tim explained earlier. These glulam beams run along those passageways, and where they cross at the node points, they create hashtags which sit between the brick piers. These timber hashtags rest on precast lintels, and the precast lintels are built into these brick piers which rise up through the building to support the chimneys above. And the lanterns, they're made of CLT panels, so these very large pieces of CLT were arriving on site. There was like a big jigsaw puzzle, and they were then assembled on site over here, kind of beside the site, and then they were craned into position. So this is the first lantern being lifted into position. I'm now going to hand over to Simon from Smith & Wallwork, the structural engineers. Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, structural engineering and the process of for the new library. I'm going to run through sort of 3 areas: the design development to detailed design, and then a few images of construction to finish off. So design development, RIBA stage 2 and 3, you can see we work on lots and lots of different ideas. There's a few sketches of mine that we, how I communicated with the team, with sort of exchanging ideas, and that really is a sort of a small part of what is a very complex project. I mean, this is a very quick insight into my brain and how I look at projects. And you saw some of the early concept sketches from Tim. On the left, you have this sort of first interpretation of a sort of simple single span timber structure into a series of spine walls. And as the design discussions developed with the team and the idea of the natural ventilation, that became more a series of cells or blocks rather than 3 sort of linear spaces. And you can see we've changed to a more 2-way spanning primary and secondary beam structure. And as Tim said, it was an architectural competition, and which Níall McLaughlin's won, and very much an influence with brick and timber structures or features in the building, and the structure very much formed the architecture in some respects. There's nowhere for the structure to hide on this project, but that mixing of materials, structural materials, provided some interesting technical challenges, from sort of differential movement of materials, fabrication and installation tolerances, and that mixing of materials also provided some interesting logistics challenges in multiple packages, trade packages having to stop and start as they build. And that process of stop-start, gives us some interesting thought processes and challenges on moisture control of timber during construction. As you can imagine, that discussion was very long. We did consult quite a lot with the industry early on, and got lots of different opinions. And we even, dabbled in trying to mix precast brick-clad concrete with timber. And one of the reasons for doing so was this sort of differential movement issue, and the fact that actually concrete and timber were working quite well there, especially when you started looking at balloon frame construction, trying to really, when we're putting timber very close to concrete or brickwork, we have to worry about how much movement there is. So that was a quick contemplation. It didn't last very long because it wouldn't have worked for a number of reasons on the project. Anyway, we ended up sort of, as I say, focusing on load-bearing brickwork structure, CLT floor deck with originally actually oak glulam structures and beams, and primary beams were having to be flitched because of the floor loading and the deflection. But along the way, that changed to spruce, primarily, I think, driven perhaps by cost. But actually, there was an interesting discussion around how a CLT floor slab and oak glulam beams would fit together in terms of visually. And then we had quite a large element of precast concrete in terms of lintels and ring beams and precast stairs. So there was a real mix of different materials, and ultimately the building sat on a facade that was almost traditional house building construction, a traditional cavity wall construction, 100 brick and 100 internal brick. So yeah, really quite sort of traditional methods of construction. I mean, those sketches also, the devil's in the detail, working out how all of those things fit together. This is the building corner details at the top of the building, at the roof, and the building gable details. We've got some flitch beams in there, and if you can just about spot, there's a precast sort of what I call boot lintel ring beam going around the whole building. And then I can't use Revit, so I do everything in sketching. So here's the hashtag lintel centrally. So this is internal chimney. There's me trying to get all of those things to marry, and you can just about see the roof perching on the internal L-shaped columns, which are reinforced because they're helping stabilize the building, bizarrely. And then even at the perimeter chimneys, some more balancing act going on with some big bits of roof coming down and sitting on an internal leaf of a cavity wall. And there's some two exclamation marks there on my sketch, making the architect understand how hard I was working for them to make it all fit together. So that's an insight into how we swap information with architects and other members of the design team. And then we move to detailed design. This project had 3 GAs for every floor level, which is quite interesting. So you have a CLT slab and beam arrangement. You then have what's holding that up in terms of a load-bearing masonry arrangement. And then sort of sandwiched in between those two, you have a lintel and beam arrangement as well for each level. So you end up with quite a few GAs on this project and an awful lot of what they call detailed drawings. We had a 2-stage tender, and Níall, Holzbau and Urban, working collaboratively, were appointed by Cox Edge, who were the main contractor, and they brought in some quite handy and useful and timely innovations to the project. Their expert knowledge and Níall Holzbau's patented GSE connection or details and costs and logistics really helped bring things to site. And one of the big impacts was being able to bring in GL34H spruce glulam in lieu of the flitch beams that we were looking at, changing that precast boot lintel into a glulam sort of boot lintel ring beam around the building, and the CLT folded plate roof pods, that striking image that Tim showed, that was an innovation brought by Urban and Níall Holzbau about building them on the ground and then lifting them in. And then looking at the low library loading, and that's where this change from flitch to the spruce GL34, looking at the different load cases and the long-term loadings, and because the book stacks were quite a main part of this loading, making sure that we got a count of the creep loading, which accounted for something like nearly 30% of the final long-term loads. So some quite detailed discussions with the library and the architects and everybody on deflections and things were required. Here you can see the general floor arrangement. So we've got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 internal chimneys, and then the perimeter chimneys around. As I say, they were L-shaped chimneys that you could walk through, and then we have the primary beams running through the page, and then the secondaries within, and then we have a mimicking of these beams through here with the hashtags internally. Here's the GA showing the brick layouts. Had 17 Newton handmade bricks in M4 mortar, and then we also mixed in some standard bricks, 20 Newton bricks, around the perimeter where they were covered with book stacks, and the lintel layout, the precast lintel layout. Lots and lots of detailed drawings, as I said, internal chimneys which are also acting as smoke venting, and in fact here the masonry runs all the way through, a bit like what I would call balloon frame construction. The timber doesn't interrupt that load path as such, but the timber does interrupt the load path through the perimeter chimneys. And that's where, you know, Urban and Níall Holzbau brought in these details with sort of reinforced bearings that allowed load paths to run through the timber because of the really small amount of area we had to land structure on brickwork. It was all very, very delicate bit of engineering and architecture and construction, I should say. And then again, the balancing of the roof pods on top of those cells with these steel shoes. Lots and lots of thoughts going in there, thinking, and Urban were key in unlocking some of those options and details, working with them in the construction stage. The whole timber floor plates were diaphragms and locked into the brickwork, but XY locked, Z direction allowed to move, so the building was allowed to breathe, if that makes sense. And you can see some of the sliding joint details here, and these strange glulam boot lintels. Some nice construction shots. I think this picture is my favorite, showing the in construction of the reinforced L-shaped brick piers. Neue Holzbau and Urban hosted us out in Switzerland, and really, really fun walking around the factory. I think these are somebody else's photos, but so you can see all the details, and this is an enhanced steel bearing to allow us to just about sit this glulam beam on a bit of concrete internally underneath one of the chimneys. So it's a reinforced bearing, and some hidden secondary beam bearings that sit on a primary. There's some more construction shots. There's a first floor, and you can see the underside of the timber structure. And then the tolerances that Coxedge and Urban achieved on site were quite phenomenal. Really fantastic bit of work. And here's a nice shot showing these stress skin pyramids or roofs, hipped roofs, sitting on these steel shoes. And I'm going to finish today on some steel work, which is probably wrong to finish on, but there you go. Those are those little shoes that were fabricated.
Thank you to Simon. The steel shoes that were just shown, I guess in the photo they look quite small, but in reality they were actually sort of the size of little stools, just to give you a sense of the scale. And they were actually quite important pieces in creating. So, for example, there's one of those little stools sitting on the corner of each of these lanterns. And they enabled, I guess, we wanted the lanterns to sit very finely on each of the corners, kind of like a stiletto at each corner. And they also enabled, in these quite pinch points of the corner, it allowed the surfaces to run around the perimeter of each of these rooms at that level. And you can see in this photo, I guess, it was quite impressive, I guess, the level of accuracy that Coxedge and the bricklayers got with quite a wobbly brick over these 3 stories. This is continuous rising up and then supporting the lantern at the top. And there was some variation, I guess, with that tolerance in the size of the lanterns when they arrived onto those pods. And then the joiners worked, I guess, with another level of precision inside that, and they clad kind of the underside of those lanterns with the acoustic absorption underneath, and then slatted timber below that. And at the apex of those lanterns, there's starts this shadow gap, and it continues downwards to reach the bottom of those lanterns, where it meets another shadow gap between the bookcases. So these 2 bookcases come in and sit at the base of that, and another shadow gap that runs around the base of the lantern. And that 15mm shadow gap, I guess, could nearly be followed around the whole building. It's quite important. It kind of relates to the 15mm joint of the brickwork, but also technically it was quite important. The beams, we sort of set a limit of a max of 15mm deflection. So the 15mm joint, which runs around the bookcase, allows that space for the deflection of the beams. And internally, I guess it's sort of a timber world, and you can see in this image there's the bookcases, the tables and the desks are all made from European oak. There's approximately like almost 2 kilometres of shelving in the building. And we were having quite frequent conversations with the librarian, who was at the same time that we were planning out the library and working with the joiners to make the bookcases. They were planning which books they would be putting in each section and trying to understand the linear meters. And at the same time, then quite early in the construction phase, because there was so much joinery, the joiners actually began making the bookcases quite early in the phase, and they stored them off-site for quite a while before bringing them then to site. And in the design of the joinery, we wanted to kind of continue this language of the continuous planks visibly resting on the thing that's supporting it. So you can see in the design of these tables, there's these long planks of European oak, and they're supported again underneath with more planks. And you can see a bit in this image as well, I guess, a good example of how we worked quite collaboratively with the subcontractors, Ben on the electrical design, and then Dean and David, who were the electrical subcontractors. We worked in quite a lot of detail to bring the light and services to each of these tables, and then again to all of the bookcases. And that language of the continuous planks and the structure visibly sitting on the thing, we continued that with the design of the balustrades, which also act as desks around the voids. And then all of the windows and the doors are also made from European oak, and this is one of the bay windows that Tim described earlier. This one is looking out onto the master's garden, and this photo is taken from one of the desks, which the librarian has told us is one of the most popular desks in the library. It's a kind of bird's nest that looks down over the entrance into the library, and you can see who's kind of coming and going. And I'll finish on this slide because it's been quite nice to see the students coming back into the library after a few years, I guess, of them studying at home, and seeing them interact and using the library. And this image, I guess, also reminds us of the painting of Saint Jerome that Tim showed at the start. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire, Ben, Tim. I'm also going to invite Níall to come up to the stage now. The last picture of Saint Jerome was actually an 11-year-old child prodigy, I understand, who's the daughter of Níall and Mary, or perhaps she was just a free model for the photo shoot. An extraordinarily, actually succinct tale of a very, very complex project. Also talking about the history of the college, but also relating back to the history of your work, what you're interested in, going back to Caen, but also the sense of place, back to a window in South London that you did 30 years ago, which I think is quite a nice thing to all of us, that in your career you are making ideas that you can continuously revisit and build. It was a long journey, this project? A dozen years, 10 years?
2014, yeah, probably yeah.
And
7 years.
Interesting, because it's highly complex to be very simple. Was there any moment where you felt the hashtag or the ring beam or any of these elements and these ambitions of the 50mm shadow gap that you were tracing around 2.2 kilometres of shelving, that you might have expected too much of your builder? Your builder was clearly a vital, it's design and build, but not as we know it, I think would be a reasonable description. There's a very important relationship with them, wasn't there?
Yes, we worked, it was really enjoyable to work with them. They'd worked with the practice before, and I think from the start they were really committed to making something that was really high quality, and they were bringing lots of good suggestions to the table, so we had lots of very productive meetings where they were coming up with good ideas, and in some cases simplifying things. So one example was the ring beam, which was a kind of complicated concrete shape, and then through those conversations it became timber and a bit more simple. So.
Well, it's design and build, I think it could be in the future, because actually I did meet them on the tour, and then later on, a couple of weeks ago here, there was a tremendous commitment from them to the craft of building this project, wasn't there? There was a sort of, a lot of them were like, this is the one project we will build in our lives that we all want to be associated with, which is, obviously helped with the 400-year brief, but also I think it's quite inspirational. I'd like to open it up to the floor. There are mics moving around. I'm sure there might be questions on the level of detail, or indeed on the much bigger picture that the project situates itself in history. Is there anyone who'd like to, gentleman at the front, if you can stand up and say who you are.
Jonathan Lowy. It's going to be a slightly loaded question, given where I'm from. Zinc company. There's a zinc roof, and how did that discussion go with the college and Historic England, given that I can imagine they wanted a tile roof rather than a quite pronounced metal roof?
I mean, I think the aspiration for us was that the roof would have a kind of lightness to it, and express this kind of folded plane of construction resting on top of that sort of heavier brickwork when you saw it from the outside. And I think it wasn't actually that difficult a conversation to convince them, because we said, well, your roofs have a kind of, lots of them, there are lead roofs, there are other roofs which are kind of grey coloured, and so this material, the zinc we have in the end, it will weather nicely, and it will sit within those other materials around the college, which are all weathering nicely. But there was quite a long and interesting conversation with the college about materials inside and outside the building, and durability and weathering and fit with the other materials of the college was a kind of key part of the driving force behind the ones we chose.
I think another question, a lady 2 rows back.
Thank you very much. My name's Julie Hill. I'm chair of a couple of environmental charities. You haven't said anything about carbon, either the carbon performance of the building, so I was quite surprised not to hear anything about how it's heated, or maybe it's not heated because it's so efficient, or the carbon in the embodied carbon in the materials. So it'd just be nice to hear a bit about that.
I could answer the heating question. So it has underfloor heating. The college had an existing gas boiler house, and we replaced that with new condensing boilers. It was designed in 2014, 2016, and we're a long way forward now. Our practice has signed the end gas pledge, so it would be a different project if we were undertaking it now. But
is there anything you want to add, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the embodied carbon side, in a way it's a similar story. These ideas about how we address the climate emergency are evolving, and since we designed that project, I think we've moved on in many ways. But the key ideas of the project for us were to make a building which kind of used materials sensibly and tried, mostly in an intuitive way, due to the lack of data at the time we were doing the first stage of the design, about ways in which you could use materials which had low embodied energy. So we maximised the use of timber. We used as little steel as we possibly could throughout the building. We used some concrete. We precast it rather than trying to do it on site, and we tried to minimise the amount of that within the building. The end calculation for the embodied life cycle carbon, sort of the whole life cycle of the building, I think is at something like 600 kilograms CO2e per square meter, which is sort of in the mid-range, I think, of where we of sort of current practice to sort of reasonable practice for offices and schools. There's no particular benchmark for libraries at the moment. And where the building doesn't perform as well as we'd probably aspire to now, it's partly to do with the archive, which contains a lot of concrete in order to produce the thermal mass that's needed to enclose that space. It's a 4-hour fire compartment. It's incredibly heavily insulated and constructed to make it work passively. So there's a kind of trade-off there between the energy embodied in the construction and avoiding the need for continual mechanical cooling of that space. So it's probably hard to quantify that, but that was the sort of thinking.
600 is quite a good target, I would say, for general construction, although that obviously number's coming down. But I think the current model is that that's 600 embodied at PC, then the estimate is a 60-year life, and that you will use that much carbon again in refitting the building. I think when you look at the building, actually, it's a 400-year life. So that's a big difference, life cycle-wise. And of course, because it's a finished piece, it's not going to get the endless strip out and remaking, although there may be some innovations that come forward to glazing or other matters. And just to situate in the wider context of the RIBA's judging, as you said, the standards have changed dramatically, and how the level and detail to which we're engaging in terms of transport materials over the last 5 years. I think under Joe Bacon's initiative during COVID, we lost a year of the awards, and the new initiative, most of you may well be aware, was to say, actually, buildings must be in operation for a year before we can be submitted. So it's quite, so we're moving in the right direction, because buildings have to be in operation. You used to walk around a Stirling Prize winning, they were still kind of plastering the building and painting it. Now, they've been tested for a year, and we appoint an independent person, Smith Mordack, to review, in this year it was Smith Mordack, to review all the projects. But we are, of course, at that point where rapid change and standards are changing. So, but at least now we're building a kind of database on where things are going, and it's something we need to kind of keep logging in our projects as we move forward. Níall, is there anything you want to add to that comment about the long-term timeline of the project, not just in terms of your practice, but in terms of the city and the college?
Well, if we're talking about embodied carbon specifically, I think it's worth talking about the duration of the building and its longevity, but it comes up in conversations I have a lot with colleges about embodied carbon, and I always have to tell them that there's a dual target they have to hit, because there's a difference between embodied carbon in the long term and the requirements of the climate emergency, which are short-term requirements. And actually, you have to think about both of those things. Because there's no point in saying, well, I'm going to build my building from immensely carbon-intensive durable materials, which will pay their way through the next 500 years, because we need to do something between now and the next few decades. So you've got to do a trade-off between those things. Like many other practices, when we designed that in the competition in 2014, we didn't pay the attention to embodied carbon that we would now. But one of the things we did was a full analysis of the embodied carbon in the building. And we've done sessions in the office, which we now do with many of our projects, to say, how would we redesign this project and do it differently if we were to try and because we've got the analysis that shows just what that concrete construction, that one small piece of concrete construction did to the embodied carbon. But I mean, there's another thing about building in time and building in history. Very interesting conversations about the brickwork, for example. Do you make the brickwork to match the Pepys Library as it is now, or as it was 400 years ago? Do you expect them to grow together so they'll match in 300 years' time? That sense of the long duration was a very important part of the thinking of the project. One of the nicest bits of the project was watching the site agent, Julian, on site, saying to his guys, you'll spend the rest of your life making noddy houses. This is brickwork. This is going to be here, when your great-great-grandchildren are around. This is the biggest gig of your life. And every single bricklayer was taught by the builder to do the best they could in that instance. And there was that sense, which you get working in historic environments, of an investment in the future. And the question I was raised about, well, isn't it good that these privileged institutions can invest this much money in their building stock? I personally don't think that's a private matter, because cities like Cambridge are cultural resources. The building stock of those cities are cultural resources for the whole country, and people care about them a lot. And I think the sense that the building fabric of a city is a reservoir of meaning, and a reservoir of identity for a society. And the fact that a new building which is built in that is going to be something which people in the whole city care about a great deal. I think there are certain places where buildings have to be invested into at that level. And I think that's one of those places.
When we went round, I think I don't know her exact role, but the lady who introduced us and showed us around the project was explaining that they have a kind of a national grid relationship, and they're actually, Magdalene's has a relationship with the Northwest. That's where they seek an engagement with the students from particular regions, so they're doing quite a lot of work to become that apparent national resource and a much more accessible university than they might historically be perceived to be, which was quite interesting to see how methodically they've begun to work that out. Are there any more questions? I'm sure, yeah, there's a whole raft of questions. So there's three in a little cluster there. You can just go round, pass the mic between the three of you.
Joshua McManus, Plan A Consultants. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I'd just like to know, were there debates early on in the process about society's changing relationship with books and how technology might impact the building's use over time?
Who wants to take that one? There? Tim?
Okay. Unless you want.
No.
No, after you. I think the college kind of acknowledged that in their brief quite openly. They said, why are we building a library now in the digital age when most of the material that students want to access is online? And I think an important part of that, which I tried to explain at the beginning of the talk, is that there's a sense in which this building, which is it's primarily a study space. They had nowhere near enough study space in their old library. They liked the character of their old library. It was sort of quite kind of hobbity, but there was near enough desk space. So they wanted this new library to have this particular kind of character, and we felt from talking to them that quite a lot of that character comes from being, as they put it in their brief, amongst books. So there is something about the situating yourself within in order to study within a space which contains the kind of accumulated knowledge that a library does. And I think the college envisage a library in some form existing. Was said the building's planned to be in use for 400 years, and they can sort of back that up because their libraries have been in use for over that time frame already. This is their third library, and so they've been slowly expanding their libraries over time. So they envisage very definitely a library existing into the future. But it'd be interesting to see what changes technology produces on the architecture that we've designed.
I mean, the evidence of the visit was it's quite it's one big compartment, acoustically and fire-wise, I assume, but it is quite soft, and people are not whispering, and there are conversations that go on, and there are gatherings of people. So that, from one visit, there does seem to be a place that people are coming to kind of break out of lonely work, and there's the sort of showpiece, Saint-Jérôme moment that your daughter enjoyed, but there's actually quite a lot of kind of people gathering in little clusters and using it as a place to work and congregate, which is quite encouraging.
I think just one thing to say about that very quickly is that when we were given the brief, and the master was Rowan Williams at the time, he brought me into his room, and he said it was primarily about the community of the college. And he said that studying, for people who are working at quite an advanced level, studying can be quite an isolated business. And he thought that the first point about the library was for people to sit and study and to see each other sitting and studying, and that it was a place for solidarity. And I think there's one thing about books, which is that they have a history. Digital media is always new when it flips into your screen, but someone else has read that book and someone else has read it before them. And that sense of being surrounded by other people's experiences, I think, was a very important part of the building.
I mean, particularly relevant in the little post-COVID blip of how do we congregate, do we work apart or together? But there are a little cluster of questions over there.
Hi, my name is Prada from Central St. Martin's, doing a part 1. As a college student myself, also, our libraries kind of spaced out in the same thing. I was wondering, in terms of the program of the space, how do you guys situate certain areas? I know for my uni, there's 3 levels too, and it's like structured according to the noise levels. So the first floor would be very noisy, and then it works its way up, and then it gets less noisy at the top. So I was wondering, does it work the same for you guys too?
Yeah,
Claire, go on.
Yeah. So I think it's not, I guess, structured so much like that, but what we were trying to do was to create like quite a mix of different types of study spaces. So we're aware that some people, prefer to study completely by themselves. So a lot of, there's like single desks tucked in behind the chimneys, which people can study by themselves. And then there's sort of moving up from that, then there's the kind of study spaces around the voids, which you can kind of be by yourself, but you can see others. Then there's the rooms which have like the small desks, you can study in a group of 4, and then you move right up to where there's that large room in the central space. And what we've heard, I guess, from the librarians is that they were kind of explaining which desks kind of go first, and it's actually quite a mix. So there's that single desk that is very popular. There's another single desk that looks out over the yew tree that's very popular, and then that large table in the centre, apparently quite a few people congregate there. So it's quite a mix.
But it was interesting, the librarian said that the same people go back to the same desks every time, so you get the sort of a sociable group who who are slightly extrovert, who sit in the middle of that long central reading room and sort of really occupy that space. And then you get a sort of quieter group who sit around the top of the 3-story void. So it's kind of interesting that people are finding their places within the building, which we're pleased about.
And the acoustic was a challenge then?
I'd defer to my colleague Níall, who's our acoustician, but I think it's a really hushed space, and I think having it being naturally ventilated gives you sort of a connection to the outside. You hear birds chirping. You don't sort of have a drone of services running in the background, which gives the space quite a nice quality. I think that all really adds to the delight of being in the building.
There was a third question of the triumvirate, still up, the arm's still up, thank you. The mic's coming to you now.
Hi, I'm Roberta Henriquez. I'm a planning officer at Harrow Council, and I'm also doing my master's in urban design and planning. So I was just wondering how you navigated the planning process in terms of the heritage constraints, because I know definitely the local authority I work for, we can be quite rigid with our policies. And I was just interested in that you built an entirely new building on the site and kind of how you navigated that.
I'm glad you said you could be quite rigid. I'll let Níall answer that question.
We had quite a tricky time of it because we won a competition, and when we presented the winning scheme to the planners at Cambridge, they said, well, you can't build a building there. Our team then had to go through a fairly lengthy process of looking at all of the sites that the college had and demonstrating why none of those other sites was suitable. But I don't think that in itself reached a point where the conservation officer at Cambridge was satisfied that we could build a building there. And something that I've found with one or two, but very few exceptions, is that when we want people on the planning side to take risks on our behalf, the people we depend upon more and more are at Historic England. You get substantial people there with enough confidence in their own judgment and enough willingness to listen and engage in dialogue that they will make judgments that someone needs to make. And in this instance, we had one person, a guy called John Níall at Historic England, who looked at at a point where the planners were still saying, we don't think you can build a building there at all. John Níall looked at our drawings and he said, I think this is a good building, and I think it will stand the test of time, and it will sit well with the building stock that's here and take its place amongst these buildings over the next few centuries, and that's what it's my job to protect. And what I really like about Historic England is they are quite academic in the way that they deal with you, in that they interrogate you and they ask you questions which you feel, oh gosh, if he's asking me that question or if she's asking me that question, they're not going to give me consent. But they're just asking you the question to give you the opportunity to give them a good answer. And if you can give good answers, they'll come back again and again. And on certain projects, we've had dialogue of up to a year with Historic England. But eventually they've said, okay, you've answered the questions and you can go ahead. So I think that's an extremely important role. And I think they have the ability to come behind the planning team and to give them courage and confidence when they might otherwise be doubting their own judgment. So we were very fortunate in that instance. And as soon as John Níall came behind it, the conservation team came behind it, and it was a very straightforward business after that.
Is there a follow-up you have to that, or does that answer your point? Thank you very much. Are there any more? There's a question here at the front, second row back. Oh, there's two, so sorry. You go first, if that's all right, then pass it on to the lady there.
Thank you. My name is Liana. My name is Liana, and I'm studying at Bartlett School of Architecture. And as a student, my question, first of all, congratulations on winning the prize. And thank you for the wonderful presentation. And seeing the presentation, I have a question about the fire safety precaution. As books are such prized possessions of the library and the community itself, I was wondering if there was any thought given to the measures to tackle an event of fire, considering there's only a diagonal movement through the building, which may not be the fastest route out of the building in case of a fire. So
I believe there are two very elegant fire escape staircases, but it is quite a complex challenge to make an open plan building that's acoustically doing a job that's also fire. But I know you're not Mr. Fire.
No.
But today you are.
I guess the college has the archive store, which is 4-hour fire rated. It's kind of built so that if the fire brigade are fighting a fire on the top floor of the building, all that water sheds off and doesn't damage the contents. So that's where they would keep their most precious things. That's why they built it like that. So yeah, I guess in the other respects, the fire engineer's design required quite a lot of smoke ventilation. So there's automatic openings in the facade and in the roof, so that the voids, that you were able to escape past the voids. I think that was their solution there.
I think your plan, you talked about what I'd call the kind of public staircase. That is the promenade through the building, but there are, I think, also two separate, actually sort of almost external, internal fire escape staircases.
So while I guess the library and those two kind of staircases that meander across the plan, they're all open in one compartment. Aside from that, there's another two staircases to the north, which are they're fire compartments in themselves. So there's that measure, and then I guess we worked with the fire engineer who did like an analysis of how the smoke would move and how the fire would move relative to the voids and how someone might escape past it, and it was through that conversation then I guess that we sized like the things like the vents to let the smoke out. So.
Thank you.
Can you pass there's a mic coming to the lady at the front. There's teamwork, thank you.
My name is Rachel Oye. I'm a chartered member. Because my background have sustainable design skills, so I always think of something critical or for design point. I see all the square roof and there's some shadow. Did you ever thought of, because we always try to minimize on the north for shadow, whatever. So did you ever thought of using triangle shape? They say south and then east and then west. Then that means there's no north and there's no shadow. And what happened when you were doing this design process? You just experience that, or it's an experimental to see what happened. They could also cut down the heat loss as well, and internal and external shadow for either one big triangle or all the triangle on top of your square, sharp.
So we did lots of work testing the amount of amount of sunlight into the space to check that it wasn't going to overheat. We were quite concerned about the gable ends facing to the south of the building, and we recommended blinds be added to those. I'm glad they didn't, because it looks fantastic with these sort of shafts of light. As you can see, I can see this image here, but you saw some earlier with sort of shafts of light that move through the space, and I think they really make it a really nice space to be in. You know what time of day it is, rather than it being just...
And also about the shaft, I see about the roof, you have this four direction, right?
Yeah.
So there's what you call the corner, it casts the shadow indoor. So what happens if we minimize the corner, become a triangle instead of four pillar, you understand?
I think this is getting quite a detailed question that you might pick up in the bar afterwards.
Yeah.
I mean, I think interesting that, I mean, glare didn't seem to be a problem when I experienced the building. You enjoyed shadow and light, and we sometimes, I think, almost over-design and worry about things to eradicate changing conditions, and actually the warmth of the sun on your face, radiant heat, light. But you know, it seemed, it's actually quite a solid building. It's 20 meters deep, isn't it? It's quite layered in its construction, and actually the bulk of the light is a single window into a room or a bit of skylight that escapes through the system. So although it's flooded with light, it's not an intense thing. In fact, your challenge was probably to get light in rather than keep it out, I would suspect. But,
yeah, I mean, we began at the competition stage thinking about having some form of north light throughout the space. But we did a lot of experimentation with roof forms as we began to design the project with the college. But I think we liked the idea that the light would have character. And it's something we kind of explored in lots of our projects, that light's not just there to provide some illumination, but it animates spaces and it changes them over time. And so we like the way the shadows and the bright patches move around the plan. And Ben did some very nice studies of the way that would happen in order for the college to understand where the light would be and how much glare would be an issue. And eventually they were convinced that it was okay to have some bright bits. And that's the trade-off between sort of a completely even, glareless illumination and some character within the space. You're going to get a bit of the odd bright spot.
I think, there's one last enthusiastic question. Oh, no, there's two. I'm going to do two if they're quick. Gentleman there, then.
Thank you. Hi. My name's Jonathan, architect and architectural photographer. Stunning set of photos, by the way, you have, and beautifully crafted building. I'm so impressed at what you've put together. My question is, I'm really interested in the chimneys and the design and the development of the chimneys and how that came about. Obviously, we learned from Ben that it contributes towards the natural ventilation system, and but it's sort of a very interesting sort of conversation that you have with the client. I want to stick a load of chimneys on your building, and you touched upon it before, and from a sort of traditional historical point of view, from an architect, having a lot of chimneys on a contemporary building is quite an odd thing to do in that sense. And I could see from some of the sort of high-level photos that you've created these sort of beautifully elegant chimneys with the cut bricks on the corners, and I was sort of looking at them thinking, how have they managed to sort of create these beautifully crafted chimneys? So I just wanted to sort of guess, was it born out of the sort of tartan grid work? Was it an aesthetic thing that you wanted to bring in? Because you've created this whole language of chimneys, both on elevation and plan, and I just, it's a major feature of the building, and I'm just quite interested to see how that
Three architects and an engineer.
I think the question you're asking is, in a way, the answer is completely self-evident and almost impossible to give, which is that the chimneys are completely rational pieces of construction that are entirely dedicated to ventilating the building in the proper way, But at a poetic level, we sort of wanted them, and we were damned if we weren't going to have them. And the best version of that story I know in architecture is this dialogue between Mies van der Rohe and Myron Goldsmith about the corner of the Lakeshore Drive apartments, where Myron goes, well, if you really believe that architecture tells the truth, you wouldn't have those two eye sections in the corner. And Mies, bit by bit, tries to think of every excuse why you have to have them practically. And eventually he says, well, I have them because I love them, because they're part of the poetic idea of the project. And I think those chimneys are the same thing. They work very hard in the building. And something, if you don't know Cambridge, is there are a lot of chimneys like that in Cambridge. So they feel, I think, like part of the city. And these quite chimneys that are somehow foregrounded on buildings, that are pushed right out to the front of buildings. So they belong to a cityscape that people in Cambridge would know. And we felt that as Tim said, the relationship between these very lightweight roof forms and then these chimneys coming through was just a sort of tectonic, poetic, formal idea that we loved. So it's between all of those things. You can take your pick.
Thank you. Last question to the Donato Benedetti, who's leading the refurbishment of 66 Portland Place.
Okay.
Just to set him up before he stands up.
Thank you, Simon. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about the genesis of the project from competition stage to what you built. So you probably touched on it, Claire, in your description, but just a little bit more about how did it change, how did it not change, how did you stick to it, but a little bit more about the genesis.
So
anyway,
were
amazing
the chimneys
building
there?
too. Yeah.
Okay,
was the silhouette familiar?
I mean, if you want real origins, I'll take you back. When I was 17,
that's what I was looking for. Yeah, exactly.
I went into first year in UCD. And my studio master was a guy called Shane de Blockham, who had just come from being one of the project architects on the Paul Mellon Center at New Haven at Yale for Louis Kahn. And he'd worked in Louis Kahn's office. And he was completely, somehow Louis Kahn had instilled a kind of mission, a kind of an incredible sense of mission into this guy. And we were all, like, I hadn't even done art in school. I had no idea where I was. And you meet this guy for whom architecture was such a central thing. And he had this sense that Kahn gave to him, that he gave to me, of a certain kind of fundamental ordering and nobility in architecture. And they say, the Jesuits say, give me a boy for the first 7 years of his life and you have the man. I think in architectural terms, give me Shane de Blockham in first year, and that's a legacy that's difficult to get past. And when you come to Cambridge and you see those Jacobean buildings, there's something that Kahn, I know Kahn studied Scottish castles, but his interest in that kind of Jacobean tradition is really obvious in his houses and in some of his brick buildings. That kind of East Coast American puritanical tradition that comes from, there's definitely a connection there with Kahn. So going to Cambridge and feeling that brick architecture, it just seemed that going back to Kahn was a very natural thing to do. When we did it, our first design for the competition was a much more spectacular library in a way. And the master, after the competition, brought me into his room and said, you've misunderstood us, this isn't a university library. This is a college library, and it's about a certain kind of domesticity. So at that stage, we had to go back and get rid of some of the bigger, more spectacular spaces, and we had to sort of bring the whole thing down a bit. And that's when I started working with these members of the team. And it's worth saying in the design conversation that we were shortlisted in the Stirling Prize for a chapel in Oxford in 2013. That was Tim. We won the Stephen Lawrence Prize for Fishing Hut. That was Tim. Claire worked with me on the Venice Biennale. We've been around together for a long time, and it was a very, very close collaboration, just trying to steer that thing in to that relationship to it being a big, substantial, institutional, communal building, and also feeling like it had the kind of domesticity and coziness of a house which they were looking for. And I suppose that was the kind of origin of the ideas in the project. And all the time what we do in the office is we exchange architectural plans and sections with each other. Do you know that section? Do you know that plan? Do you know that section? And that's the way we talk to each other through the design. Is there anything you'd like to say about it?
Maybe just add, I think, when we won the competition, as Níall said, they had concerns about the scale and grandeur of the scheme we came up with, and they asked us to come back and sort of represent the ideas and have another go at it, which is a strange kind of thing within a competition setting. Because you think, I've had the good idea, now just take it. But they didn't. They wanted us, and what they wanted was a dialogue, and I think they felt we engaged in that at the second interview, and we carried on doing that the whole way through the design process. And we had often quite tough and sometimes quite difficult conversation with them, where they would be very critical about specific aspects of the design, and that's really kind of honed the project, as well as the kind of dialogue within the office and with the design team.
Claire, is there anything you want to add to that? Contradict it all?
Well, just to follow on, I guess, a big part of it was how engaged the client was. So nearly every month we had these quite detailed conversations with them, and we would show them what we were working on, decisions that we were making. And there's a team in the college who know this building, inside out. They were involved in a lot of the decisions, from quite big decisions right down to minute details. So that was very important.
Okay, I think that's a great note to end on. I think 50 years ago, Alex Gordon talked about long life, loose fit, low energy. He also said, let's have less ad hoc innovation, more building on the shoulders of others. And this is very much a story of building on the shoulders of others, and fascinating for that. Thank you, Claire, Tim, Ben, Níall, and Simon, the engineer, who's on half term, like some of you here. Thank you very much indeed.